I had just encountered the most audacious display of entitlement I had ever witnessed. A woman, radiating a manufactured sense of importance, had transformed our flight into her own personal stage, attempting to bulldoze her way past the flight crew and gain access to the cockpit. Her reasoning, delivered with an air of unearned authority, was that she was simply too important to be bound by rules. Little did she know that beneath my unassuming exterior lay the watchful gaze of an air marshal, and her performance was about to reach an abrupt and humbling conclusion. But let me rewind. Let me set the stage before the curtain rose on this mid-air drama. The air inside the terminal at Los Angeles International Airport was heavy, stagnant. It was a familiar blend of floor cleaner, jet fuel, and the low, pervasive anxiety that clings to weary travelers. I sat slouched in a worn chair near gate 72B, another anonymous figure lost in the pre-flight shuffle. Hoodie up, sunglasses obscuring my eyes, even though the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. To the casual observer, I was Fred Monk, a mid-level consultant perhaps, on his way back to a life of spreadsheets and deadlines in Denver. But beneath the disguise, I was Federal Air Marshal Fred Monk, and my responsibility was to ensure the safe arrival of this airborne metal tube filled with unsuspecting strangers. This particular flight had been flagged, not for any specific threat, but rather for a statistical anomaly. A slight uptick in diversions, a minor increase in passenger incidents, a subtle tremor on the risk assessment radar that warranted the presence of someone like me to oversee the journey. Most of the time, these missions yielded nothing. A drunken salesman, a couple squabbling over an armrest. The hours stretched on, filled with forced stillness as I meticulously analyzed the subtle cues of human behavior. The nervous fidgeting with a carry-on, the tremor in a voice ordering coffee. It was the quiet that truly wore you down, not the moments of chaos. And then, the noise arrived. Her name, I would later discover, was Karen Tillman, but her type was immediately recognizable. She moved through the gate area like a gathering storm, drawing all the calm out of the surrounding air. Her voice was a carefully calibrated weapon, loud enough to command attention, yet just below the threshold of an outright yell. She brandished her phone on a pink, jewel-encrusted gimbal, the lens pointed squarely at her face, the screen reflecting her perfectly coiffed, perpetually indignant expression. "You will not believe the absolute incompetence at the check-in counter," she announced to her invisible audience, her voice laced with disdain. They had the audacity to weigh my carry-on. My carry-on, as if I, a million-mile flyer, don't know the rules. She paused, allowing her manufactured outrage to linger in the air. A few weary travelers glanced up from their phones, annoyed, before quickly averting their gaze, each one instinctively recoiling from the oncoming storm. I simply watched, observing. An older gentleman across from me muttered, "Is she rehearsing? Off-Broadway, very off." I replied, keeping my voice low. He snorted, "Hope it's a short show." "Depends on the audience," I said, and indeed, a handful of phones were already pointed in her direction. She was a caricature, yes, but a dangerous one. People like her truly believe that rules are meant for everyone else. They perceive regulations as personal insults, and they see fellow passengers as mere props in their daily drama. My Uncle Peter used to say, "Some people walk through life like they're the only ones with a script." Karen Tillman was the writer, director, and star of her own terrible movie, and we were all simply unpaid extras. The gate agent announced the commencement of Group 1 boarding. Karen, who had strategically positioned herself near the front, surged forward, her rolling bag acting as a miniature battering ram. She cut in front of an elderly couple, flashing her boarding pass as if it were a royal decree. I waited for my group to be called, blending in with the other weary souls in Group 2. My process was always the same. Blend in. Observe. Don't draw a single glance. I was just another guy in a gray hoodie, the most forgettable man in the room. That was the goal. I filed onto the jet bridge, my single duffel bag slung over my shoulder. It contained little more than a book I would likely never read and the tools of my trade. As I stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of recycled air and faint disinfectant greeted me. The flight attendants offered tired smiles, which I returned with a nod. Karen was already ensconced in Seat 1C, the aisle seat in the first row of first class. Her phone was propped up on her tray table, still recording. She was loudly complaining to the flight attendant about the absence of a pre-departure beverage. I mean, what is the point of status if there's no service? My seat was 2A, also an aisle seat, directly behind her, across the narrow walkway. First class was a 2-to-2 configuration, tight lanes, with clear sight lines to the galley and the cockpit door, strategically built for quick maneuvers. It was the perfect vantage point. As I moved to pass her, my duffel bag may have brushed the air an inch from her shoulder. Her head snapped around, her eyes cold and assessing, scanning my simple hoodie, my worn jeans, my generic sneakers. A sneer curled her lip. She didn't lower her voice. She wanted the cabin, and her online audience, to hear this. "Oh, great," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "People like you don't usually sit in first class." She paused, letting the insult linger. "I hope you know how to behave." The elderly woman she had cut off earlier leaned forward and stage whispered, "Honey, he looks cleaner than your soul." Her husband added, "And better shoes." I kept my face neutral, but an inner voice applauded. A few heads turned. The man across the aisle from her visibly flinched. I felt a familiar cold spark ignite in my gut, the urge to respond with something dry and cutting. But that wasn't the job. The job was to be gray, invisible. So I did nothing. I showed no reaction. I simply paused, met her gaze for a fleeting, emotionless second, and then continued to my seat. I stowed my bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and fastened my seatbelt. I didn't look at her again. I kept count. The core question began to form in my mind, the one that always surfaced with people like her. What makes someone feel untouchable? Is it money, status, the number of followers on a social media app? She genuinely believed she was shielded from consequence. She had no idea who or what was sitting in 2A. The plane door hadn't even been armed, and she was already the single biggest variable, the most likely point of failure in this complex, fragile system. She was the spark, and I was the extinguisher, equipped with a badge and better timing. She was a storm brewing inside a sealed cabin at 35,000 feet, and I was the lightning rod waiting for the strike. The soft chime of the flight attendant call button sounded, but it wasn't for a passenger request. It was a signal. Leah, the purser, moved down the aisle with practiced ease, her smile professional, but her eyes sharp. She had been flying this route for years. I recognized her from a dozen other uneventful trips. She was steady, the kind of crew member you wanted when things started to unravel. She stopped at my row, her focus ostensibly on the woman by the window, but her body angled slightly toward me. "Mr. Monk," she said, her voice at a polite conversational volume. "Can I get you a pre-departure water? We have still or sparkling." This was it, the quiet little dance of confirmation. It wasn't in any passenger-facing manual. It was a simple verbal handshake developed over years of collaboration. The specific words could vary, but the structure was always the same. A simple choice. My answer was the countersign. "Still is fine. Thanks," I replied, my tone even. "It's been a long day." Leah's eyebrow ticked up a millimeter. Our entire plan encapsulated in a single pixel. "Right away," she said to nobody in particular, and disappeared as good help always does. The word "still" was the key. It informed her that I was the designated federal air marshal on this flight, that I was active, on duty, and that she and I were now partners in a silent contract to ensure the safety of this flight. Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly, a barely noticeable acknowledgement. "Of course," she said, and moved on. No one else in the cabin would have noticed the exchange. It was as mundane as asking for a blanket. But now, the most important person on the crew knew who I was and where I was sitting. The first piece had been placed on the board. I pulled out my phone, feigning interest in an article, but my mind was already constructing a three-dimensional map of the cabin. My seating choice, 2A aisle, wasn't random. From here, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the cockpit door. I could see the forward galley, the lavatory, and every individual who entered or exited that critical space. I was one row back from our live streaming problem in 1C, close enough to intervene in under a second, yet far enough to avoid signaling any undue attention. The aisle seat afforded me mobility. I couldn't afford to be trapped during an incident, and being boxed in by a sleeping passenger was a liability I couldn't tolerate. My training emphasized angles, sight lines, and minimizing response time. This seat ticked every box. If I breathed on the cockpit door, I could fog the paint, but of course, I wasn't planning to. Good boundaries were essential. My eyes scanned the cabin, not as a passenger, but as a predator assessing a new environment. I wasn't looking for threats in the traditional sense. Not yet. I was cataloging people, assets, and liabilities. In 3D, a large man with a military-style haircut sat ramrod straight. His hands were clean, his knuckles solid. He possessed the calm, watchful eyes of a man who had witnessed real trouble and remained unimpressed by it. He was an asset. I mentally tagged him, Marcus. Across the aisle in 3C sat a man who was the polar opposite. He was sweating despite the cool cabin air. His eyes darted around nervously, but they inevitably returned to Karen in 1C. He was with her, a partner, a liability. The junior flight attendant, a young man named Rory, was already looking overwhelmed. Karen had snapped at him twice regarding her non-existent drink, and he was flustered, apologizing profusely. He was a weak link, someone who could be intimidated or manipulated. This was the part of the job that Dave would find excruciatingly tedious. It was a mental spreadsheet of human behavior. You observe, you catalog, you build a profile of the flight. Every trip was a new equation, a sealed tube filled with variables. My role was to solve that equation before it fell apart. On most flights, the answer was simple. Everyone behaves, and we land safely. But you couldn't assume. You had to prepare for the outlier, for the variable that refused to conform. Today, that variable had a name and a live stream. I thought about Dave, trying to manage 30 teenagers who believed history was just a collection of dead people. He faced this kind of entitlement every day, albeit in a less concentrated form. He always said the key was finding the leverage, the one thing they cared about more than their own ego. For a teenager, it might be a grade or a spot on the basketball team. For Karen, I suspected it was her audience, her perceived status. The very thing that made her feel untouchable was also her greatest vulnerability. She was performing for them. That performance had rules, and if she violated those rules, her audience might turn against her. I settled back into my seat, projecting an aura of weary indifference. Inside, I was a coiled spring. The cabin was a chessboard. I knew where the king was, behind the reinforced door at the front. I knew who the queen was, the loud, disruptive woman in row 1. I had identified my knight, the steady ex-military man in 3D, and a potential pawn in the nervous man in 3C. Leah was my rook, controlling the board from the galley. The game hadn't begun yet. We were still on the ground, a fragile illusion of civilization holding strong. But we would be taking off soon, and at 35,000 feet, the rules changed. The board shrunk. There were no easy exits. I had my mental map. I had my assets and liabilities cataloged. And I had one very loud, very predictable problem in 1C, a woman who was utterly convinced by her own hype. The pre-flight announcements began, a soothing drone of safety instructions that 90% of the passengers ignored. I listened to every word. The true test wasn't on the ground. It was up there in the thin, cold air where help was minutes away and trouble was always only a heartbeat from your door. The jet bridge pulled away with a low groan, and the plane began its slow, lumbering push back from the gate. This was the first major transition point, the moment we went from being a room connected to a building to a self-contained vessel. It was a psychological shift for everyone on board, but especially for someone like Karen. On the ground, she could, in theory, be removed. The gate agent, the ground crew, the airport police, they were all still within reach. Once that door closed and we were under federal jurisdiction, the power dynamic shifted. She seemed to understand this, and it emboldened her. As we taxied toward the runway, she unbuckled her seat belt and stood up, reaching for the overhead bin. "Excuse me, ma'am," Leah said, appearing instantly at her side. "You need to be seated with your seat belt fastened for taxi, takeoff, and landing." Karen waved a dismissive hand, not even looking at her. She was addressing her phone, which was still perched on the tray table, still recording. "You see this? This is the kind of power-mad nonsense you have to deal with. I just need my hydrating face mist. My skin gets so dry on these flights." Leah's voice remained calm, but firm. "Ma'am, it's a federal aviation regulation. I need you to sit down and buckle up now." Karen finally turned to Leah, her eyes flashing with anger. "Do you know who I am? I have over 2 million followers. One post from me, and this airline stock will tank. Now, are you going to let me get my face missed, or do I have to make this a bigger issue? A gate agent stepped on, issued a formal misconduct warning, and she went quiet long enough for the door to close and push back to start. This was the test, a classic power play. She was probing the system, looking for the weak point. She was using her perceived influence as a weapon against a flight attendant simply performing her job. The nervous man in 3C visibly shrank in his seat, as if attempting to disappear. The young flight attendant, Rory, who was working in the galley, looked terrified. Leah, however, didn't flinch. She was a professional. I know you're frustrated, ma'am, but the rules are for everyone's safety, including yours. We can't proceed to take off until you are seated. From my seat, I watched the exchange, my body relaxed, but my mind running through the protocols. If she refused, Leah would have to inform the captain. The captain would then have a choice, return to the gate or press on. Returning to the gate meant a delay, paperwork, and a major headache for everyone. Some pilots would cave, just to avoid the hassle. I hoped this one wouldn't. This was a critical moment. If Karen won this small battle, she would be emboldened to escalate later in the flight. You had to draw the line early and hard. My hand rested on my thigh, loose, ready. I wouldn't intervene over a face missed, but I was prepared for what might come next. Leah held her ground. Ma'am, please sit down. The please was a courtesy. The tone was an order. Karen stared her down for a long moment, a silent battle of wills playing out in the aisle of first class. The hum of the engines waiting on the tarmac seemed to grow louder in the tense quiet. Finally, with a dramatic sigh for her audience, Karen slumped back into her seat. Fine, she snapped, loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. I'll just let my skin shrivel up and die because of your ridiculous, petty rules. She slammed the seat belt buckle into place with theatrical force. Leah gave a crisp, professional nod and retreated to the galley. The crisis was averted for now, but it was a warning shot. Karen had tested the fence and found it electrified. She now knew the crew, or at least the purser, wouldn't be easily cowed. She would have to try a different tactic. The plane turned onto the active runway, the engines spooling up with a deep, powerful roar. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, smooth and confident. Flight attendants, please be seated for takeoff. We accelerated down the runway, the cabin vibrating. And then, that magical, weightless moment as we lifted into the dark Los Angeles sky. We were airborne. We were a closed system. For the next couple of hours, the only authority that mattered was inside this aluminum tube. Karen had lost her first skirmish, but I knew she wasn't done. People like her don't simply give up. They regroup, they re-strategize. Her little outburst wasn't just about face missed. It was about establishing dominance. She had failed, and that failure would fester. As the plane climbed through the clouds, I watched her. She was tapping furiously on her phone, likely crafting a narrative of victimhood for her followers. She was building her case, justifying whatever she was planning to do next. The seatbelt sign pinged off. The game was on. The gate warning stuck for a minute. She pivoted. No more loud. Now it was sneaky. I could feel it in the air. A subtle shift in the cabin's energy. The opening moves were over. Now we were in the middle game, and I knew with a certainty that settled like a cold stone in my stomach that she was just getting started. The first hour of the flight passed in a deceptive calm. The beverage service began, a ritual of normalcy designed to soothe nervous flyers and pass the time. Karen accepted a glass of champagne with the air of a monarch bestowing a great favor, making a show of inspecting the glass for spots before taking a sip. She kept her phone recording, providing a running commentary on the subpar service and the questionable quality of the complimentary nuts. When service moved on, she palmed a silver flask and a couple of anxiety pills, dosing between takes. Not airline service, her own stash. I declined a drink, taking another bottle of water instead. Hydration and vigilance were the only two things I needed in the air. I kept my focus split, one part of my brain listening to the low hum of the engines and the rhythm of the cabin, the other part watching her. She was communicating with the nervous man in 3C, not with words, but with subtle glances, a slight nod, a fractional tilt of her head. He would look at his phone, then quickly look up at her, then look away. They were coordinating. This wasn't a solo act. That changed everything. A lone disruptor was one kind of problem. A coordinated team was another entirely. My internal threat level ticked up a notch. Just as we were passing over the desolate, dark expanse of the Nevada desert, it began. A frantic series of dings from the flight attendant call button echoed from the back of the plane. Not just one press, but a rapid, panic sequence. Ding, 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 ding. Rory, the young flight attendant, hurried down the aisle from the forward galley. Leah was right behind him. I leaned out into the aisle slightly, my view tracking them as they disappeared into the economy cabin. A moment later, a passenger in the coach section stood up and shouted, "Is there a doctor on board? Someone's having trouble breathing." The classic script. It could be real, of course. Medical emergencies happened all the time. But the timing felt wrong. It felt convenient. My eyes snapped back to Karen. She hadn't even turned around. She just sat there, sipping her champagne, a faint, knowing smile on her face. She knew this was going to happen. This was her move, the diversion, the chaos she needed to cover her real objective. Suddenly, the captain's voice came on, calm and authoritative. "Folks, we seem to have a bit of light chop up ahead. I'm going to turn the seatbelt sign back on. Please return to your seats and make sure those belts are securely fastened." The plane began to buck gently, a rhythmic swaying motion, light turbulence. Not dangerous, but just enough to put people on edge, the perfect catalyst. Leah's voice, amplified by the PA system, cut through the cabin. "We have a medical situation in row 28. Please, if you are a medical professional, press your call button." A woman in row 15 did. Leah and Rory began the process of moving the heavy beverage cart back up the aisle to clear a path. And that's when Karen's partner in 3C made his move. He stood up, feigning a need to use the lavatory. "Sir," Leah said, her voice tight. "The captain has turned on the seatbelt sign. You need to stay in your seat." "It's an emergency," he mumbled, his face pale and slick with sweat. He wasn't a good actor. He pushed past her, heading for the forward lavatory right next to the cockpit door. At the same time, from the back, the other flight attendant started moving the second beverage cart forward. The plan was obvious now. They were creating a pincer movement. The medical emergency in the back drew the crew's attention in one of the carts. The nervous man's lavatory emergency created a justification for him to be at the front, and the two carts moving toward the middle would effectively jam the aisle, trapping the crew and any helpful passengers in the rear of the aircraft. It was a simple, elegant, and dangerous plan. A kid in 4A tugged his mom's sleeve. "Is this like the safety video?" The mom said. "It's like the part they skip." The kid nodded solemnly. They should unskip it. The light chop was getting a little heavier now, the plane jostling more insistently. The pieces were moving into place, exactly as she had designed. I stayed put, just another passenger mildly annoyed by the chop. But my heart rate was elevated, my senses on high alert. I watched the nervous man lock himself in the forward lavatory. I watched Karen take another delicate sip of her drink, the picture of unconcerned luxury. She was the director, and her play was unfolding perfectly. The aisle was blocked. The crew was distracted. The passengers were strapped in and looking back toward the commotion in coach. All eyes were pointed away from the front of the plane. All eyes except for mine. The air tasted like anticipation, a manufactured storm brewing just for us. For weeks, I'd been chasing shadows, whispers of a plan so audacious it bordered on the impossible, and now, the pieces were falling into place. She was about to move. The counterfeit illness, a mere distraction. The baggage cart incident, a cleverly laid snare. But what was her true objective? My gaze locked onto the cockpit door, its cold, unyielding surface a constant reminder of the stakes. That was it, the heart of everything. Always the target. It wasn't a question of if, but when. And I was the only obstacle standing in her way. As the passengers' attention fixated on the unfolding drama in coach, Karen seized her opportunity. With practiced grace, she rose from her seat, a half-empty champagne flute clutched in her hand, and drifted towards the forward galley. Her movements were deceptively casual, portraying a simple thirst for a refill. The young flight attendant, Rory, was occupied with the medical emergency in the back, leaving Leah to manage the front. For a fleeting moment, the galley stood vacant, a window carved out by Karen's careful orchestration. Rory momentarily reappeared, prompting Karen to playfully threaten, "Refill, or I'll tag you by name." Rory, glancing nervously at Leah, conceded and retreated. Karen's smile mirrored a chess player's satisfaction at capturing a pawn. She was playing a different game than everyone else on board. I remained still, every fiber of my being focused on her. Her reflection shimmered in the darkened cabin window, a distorted, fisheye view revealing her clandestine actions. She steadied herself against the bulkhead as the plane swayed, feigning a struggle with the turbulence. But her eyes, sharp and calculating, were not on the floor. They scanned the galley, cataloging every detail, searching for her prize. Her target, a small, unassuming crew bag nestled beside the purser's jump seat, held Leah's personal belongings, including the coveted galley service key. That key could unlock a world of possibilities, including the cockpit door's keypad and deadbolt. Every instinct urged me to act, to intercept her before she could even approach the bag. Yet, protocol was unwavering. No intervention without an overt act. Reaching for the key was not a crime, but using it would be. Premature exposure could backfire, pushing her to unpredictable extremes or allowing her to deny everything and cast me as the aggressor. My mission wasn't merely to neutralize the threat, but to do so with minimal disruption and risk to the passengers. So, I waited, watching her reflection, a distorted mirror to her deception. She leaned over, pretending to retrieve something from the floor. Her hand, swift as a striking serpent, darted towards the key. The touch was delicate, a pickpocket's finesse in a crowded city. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal. My muscles coiled, ready to spring. I was halfway out of my seat, poised to launch myself across the aisle. But at the last possible second, Leah turned, as if guided by an unsettling sixth sense. 2 quick steps brought her back into the galley. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Leah's voice was sharp as ice. Karen recoiled, straightening up with a flustered but defiant air. "I was just getting another glass of water," she stammered, her voice a shade too high. "And I thought I dropped an earring." Leah's eyes narrowed, unconvinced. Her gaze flickered to her bag, then back to Karen. The accusation hung heavy in the air between them. Leah knew what Karen had attempted, and Karen knew that she knew. While the medical emergency continued in the back, the real battleground was now confined within the narrow walls of the galley. "The seatbelt sign is on," Leah stated, her voice a low growl. "Get back in your seat now." For the first time, a flicker of something other than arrogance surfaced in Karen's eyes, perhaps fear, or simply the raw frustration of being thwarted. She shot a venomous glare at Leah, spun on her heel, and stalked back to her seat, her mask of untouchable superiority firmly back in place. Immediately, her fingers flew across her phone, a furious blur of thwarted ambition. She had failed to acquire the key. Phase 1 had crumbled. But the nervous man remained locked in the forward lavatory, the aisle blocked, the diversion still in play. This was merely a setback, not a defeat. I settled back into my seat, releasing a slow, controlled breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It had been close, too close. My estimation of Leah rose sharply. She was observant, resourceful, and unfazed. A valuable asset. But Karen's facade was shattered, at least in the eyes of the crew. The pretense was gone. She had revealed her intentions. My mind returned to the fundamental question. What fueled her sense of untouchability? The conviction that she was unseen, or that those who saw her were too intimidated to act. Karen had just learned that Leah was watching, unafraid. She would now assume that others were watching too, raising the stakes and pushing her towards desperation. The failed key grab was not the end, but the spark igniting a more dangerous phase. Denied the key, she would seek another way to breach the cockpit door. And with her accomplice nearby, that likely meant force. The subtle part of the operation was over. The violent phase was about to begin. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through the hushed atmosphere. "Folks, Tower has advised us of some unexpected severe turbulence ahead. We're going to try and climb over it, but it's going to be a bumpy few minutes. Flight attendants, take your jump seats immediately." His tone was calm, but the word severe carried a heavy weight. It was a genuine warning. As if on cue, the plane plummeted. Not a gentle dip, but a sickening lurch that lifted passengers from their seats and sent stomachs soaring into throats. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. Outside the window, blackness engulfed everything. We were flying blind into a turbulent abyss. The beverage cart, unsecured by Leah, broke free and hurtled across the galley, slamming into the forward bulkhead with a deafening crash. A full bottle of red wine, dislodged from the top shelf, hung suspended in the air for a surreal moment before shattering against the galley wall. The sound of breaking glass was sharp and sudden. A gunshot in the tense silence. A crimson spray arced across the galley, not blood, but Merlot. The scent was immediate, sweet and unsettling, a winery trapped inside a washing machine. My gaze immediately settled on it. A large, jagged shard of dark green glass, the bottle's neck, lay on the galley floor. It was thick, heavy, and wickedly sharp. A perfect improvised weapon. Karen's eyes snapped to it, her frustration and anger melting away, replaced by a cold, calculating focus. This was an opportunity, a gift from the chaotic sky. The turbulence had bestowed upon her what her plan lacked, a weapon. The plane shuddered again, a violent side-to-side tremor that rattled the overhead bins. Screams pierced the air. The medical emergency in the back was instantly forgotten. Real fear, raw and primal, had taken its place. Leah, strapped into her jump seat, her face pale but composed, also stared at the broken glass, recognizing its significance. Rory remained out of sight in the back. Marcus, the ex-military man in 3D, braced himself on the seat in front of him, riding out the turbulence with stoic resolve. The nervous man remained confined to the lavatory. The entire cabin was frozen, caught between the external violence and the chilling threat on the galley floor. My training demanded that I assess the environment, recognizing every object as a potential tool or threat. The broken bottle was now the most dangerous thing on the plane. In the confined space of an aircraft, even a crude blade was terrifyingly effective, capable of intimidation, hostage-taking, and forcing entry into the cockpit. Karen's plan had evolved from stealth to open violence. She was no longer trying to trick her way in, but to fight her way in. The plane dropped again, more violently this time. The lights flickered, plunging the cabin into darkness for a heart-stopping moment before the emergency lights flickered to life, casting an eerie glow. In that brief darkness, I saw her move. Unbuckling her seat belt under the cover of the jolt, she half rose from her seat, her eyes gleaming in the dim light, her gaze fixed on the shard of glass. She was going for it. The balance of power had shifted instantly. Previously, it was a battle of rules and authority. Now, it was a physical confrontation. Her sense of untouchability came from her elevated position. Now she felt empowered by the weapon within reach. The turbulence, once a hindrance, was now the perfect cover. People were terrified, disoriented, and strapped down. The crew was immobilized. No one could stop her. Except me. The time for quiet observation was over. The moment I'd been preparing for, the reason I was on this flight, had arrived. She was unbuckled, the weapon within reach, her accomplice mere feet from the cockpit door. This was the final overt act. As she lunged for the broken bottle, I knew I had to move. Turbulence be damned. The safety of everyone on board depended on what happened in the next 5 seconds. The lavatory door flew open. The nervous man, his face a mask of sweat and desperation, burst out. He wasn't heading back to his seat. He launched himself at the cockpit door, his hands clawing at the seam, his shoulder ramming against the reinforced panel. The door didn't budge. It was a fortress. Shoulders bounce. Bolts don't. He screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure panic. Let us in. Let us in now. At the exact same moment, Karen, moving with surprising speed, scooped up the jagged neck of the wine bottle from the galley floor. She held it like a dagger, its sharp edge glinting in the dim emergency lights. Glass cuts, not steel. He hammered at the door. She guarded the aisle, a two-pronged assault. The passengers in the front rows recoiled, their fear of the turbulence replaced by the stark terror of the assault. Leah, trapped in her jump seat, could only watch in horror. It was a nightmare scenario, a coordinated, violent attempt to breach the cockpit at 35,000 feet during a severe weather event. There was no more time for subtlety, no more blending in. I moved. As the plane bucked, I used the momentum, unbuckling and launching myself across the aisle in a single fluid motion. I landed in a crouch between Karen and the cockpit door, blocking her path. She sized me up. Security in a hoodie? I said, budget cuts, then louder. Federal Air Marshal. The joke evaporated. The orders remained. Federal Air Marshal. I yelled, my voice cutting through the chaos. Drop the weapon. Get on the ground. The words were automatic, drilled into me over hundreds of hours of training. Announce yourself. Give a clear command. Remove all ambiguity. Simultaneously, I reached into my jacket and displayed my credentials and badge, holding them high for Leah and others to see. Karen froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't in her script. The gray, forgettable man from 2A wasn't supposed to be a factor. That hesitation was all I needed. I also needed to secure the aisle behind me. I couldn't fight forward while worrying about my back. I locked eyes with Marcus, the ex-military man in 3D. He was already unbuckling, his face grim and focused. He recognized a command voice. You, I shouted, pointing at him. Block the aisle. Nobody gets past you. He didn't ask questions. He nodded once, a sharp, affirmative gesture, and moved his large frame into the aisle, facing the rest of the cabin. Smile for the live stream, big guy, I said. He didn't. That's why I liked him. He became a human wall. He was deputized. The cabin was secure behind me. The nervous man at the cockpit door ignored me, still pounding his fists against the metal. They're not listening, he shrieked at Karen. Do something. Karen, snapping out of her shock, snarled and raised the broken bottle, her knuckles white. You're not real, she hissed. You're nobody. Get out of my way. She lunged, not at me, but towards the cockpit door, trying to bypass me and assist her partner. The plane lurched violently to the side. I rode the motion, staying balanced. She was clumsy, fueled by rage and adrenaline, not training. I didn't need to be stronger, just smarter. I wasn't focused on the weapon but on the hand wielding it. The threat isn't the object, it's the intent. And her intent was clear. She wanted to get through that door. The passengers were screaming. The cabin, a space of relative order minutes ago, had descended into chaos. The lights flickered again. The man kept hammering the door. Karen poised to strike. And I stood in the middle, the last line of defense between 180 souls and the abyss. The time for words was over. It was time to end this. As Karen lunged, I moved inside her attack. Standard procedure dictates creating distance, but in the confines of a fuselage, that's impossible. You crowd the attacker, fouling their range. I sidestepped her clumsy slash, my left hand clamping down on her right wrist, the one holding the glass. My thumb pressed hard into the nerve cluster on the back of her hand as my fingers wrapped around her wrist bone. A simple pain compliance technique, incredibly effective. Her eyes widened as a jolt of pain shot up her arm. Her grip faltered. Her breath hit my cheek, sharp with vape and cheap champagne. You can't, she started. I can, I said, turning her wrist to a sharp angle. Drop it. My voice was low and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos around us. She tried to pull away, but my grip was like steel. I twisted her arm, forcing her wrist into a lock that bent her body forward, off balance and helpless. Her arrogance vanished, replaced by pain. The glass shard clattered to the floor. I kicked it under a seat. Evidence travels better than rumors. On your knees, I commanded, applying more pressure. She sank to the floor, whimpering. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds. With Karen neutralized, I turned to her partner. He was still pounding on the cockpit door. Sir, on the ground now. He glanced back, saw Karen kneeling with me controlling her, and his fight collapsed. He was a follower, not a leader. Without her, he was just a scared man. He slid down the cockpit door and put his hands on his head, sobbing. Just like that, the immediate threat was contained. Now control needed to be established. Back in row 28, the patient made a rapid recovery the second the aisle cleared. Performance over. I pulled flex cuffs from my pocket. Leah cuffs. She was already out of her jump seat. The worst of the turbulence passed. Per SOP, she waited for the call before moving, smart. She grabbed cuffs from the emergency kit. I secured Karen's hands behind her back, pulling the plastic tight. Leah, guided by my instructions, did the same for the man. He offered no resistance. Now they were restrained, but I couldn't leave them in the aisle. I hauled Karen to her feet. We're moving. I propelled her towards her seat in row 1, pushing her into the window seat, the one farthest from the aisle. I used the seat belt, looping it through her cuffs and around her waist, cinching it tight. A field expedient restraint, turning the seat itself into containment. She couldn't stand, couldn't reach anyone. She was secure. She spat curses. You're done. I'll end your career live. I nodded at the dead camera on her tray. Low battery, like your plan. Leah and Marcus helped me move the man to the seat next to her. We secured him the same way. They were secured side by side in the first row. The operation was done quickly, quietly, and with as much professionalism as we could muster. The passengers watched in stunned silence, fear and relief warring on their faces. A guy in a suit raised a hand. So, refunds? Leah said, Sir, we're giving you life. He nodded. Fair. The kid in 4A gave me a thumbs up. 10 out of 10 wrist twist. His mom winced. We don't rate wrist twists. Okay, he said, 10 out of 10 safe landings, I said. That's the only rating I collect. The threat was over. Order was restored. I stood in the aisle, taking a deep breath. My heart raced, but my hands were steady. I scanned the cabin. No one injured. The crew safe. The cockpit secure. I keyed the intercom button in the galley. This is the onboard Federal Air Marshal. The situation is under control. Please remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened. The flight crew is safe, and we will be on the ground shortly. I looked at Leah. She gave me a shaky nod. I looked at Marcus. He was still standing guard. I nodded. You can stand down. Thank you. A nervous voice came from 1D. Marshal, should we keep our shoes on? Yes, I said in case the floor tries to steal them. Laughter rippled, brave but small. Leah mouthed thanks as she passed with trash bags. Order felt real. He nodded and returned to his seat. Owe you a beer, he said. I whispered. Make it 2, government salary, I said. 1 and a high five. He grinned. Deal. The adrenaline receded, leaving familiar weariness in its place. The fight was over. Now came getting this plane down safely. The call to the cockpit was brief. I used the flight deck phone, punching the emergency code. The captain answered, his voice tight. Status? There was no preamble. Marshal Monk. 2 subjects attempted to breach the flight deck. Both in custody, restrained and secured in seats 1A and 1C. The cabin secure. No injuries to crew or passengers. The weapon neutralized. I heard a long exhale. Copy that, Marshal. Good work. We're declaring an emergency and requesting priority landing in Denver. We'll be on the ground in approximately 20 minutes. The authorities have been notified. Copied. I replied and hung up. Denver Center cleared us direct. The captain owned the sky. I owned the cabin. 20 minutes. I had to keep the cabin calm for 20 minutes while we performed what amounted to a controlled fall. I turned to Leah. He's bringing us down fast. We need to prep the cabin. Total compliance. No exceptions. She nodded, her professionalism returning. She relayed the orders over the intercom. The descent began. The nose pitched down, and the engine spooled back to a whistle. The sensation was unmistakable. We were dropping fast. Alarm rippled through the passengers. This didn't feel like a normal approach. I took the PA microphone. My voice needed to be the calmest thing they'd ever heard. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Federal Air Marshal again. As you can feel, we have begun our emergency descent into Denver. Standard emergency descent. Pilots in control. Stay seated. Belts tight. Eyes on the crew. I repeated it. I needed them to focus on my voice, not the feeling in their stomachs. Leah and her team moved with efficiency, checking belts, securing the galley. They were magnificent. A thin line. I stood in the aisle, a symbol of control. I didn't sit. I wanted them to see me. Hands shot up. Sir, should we pray? If it helps you, but tighten that belt. A college kid asked, Are we going to die? Not on my shift. Row 5 asked if they could text their mom. Airplane mode, and tell her you love her when we land. Row 2 asked about snacks. If you behave, Leah said, sweeping past like a general. Laughter rippled, small, human, useful. Karen Tillman started yelling, curses and threats. She was trying to claw back control. I walked over and leaned close to her face. I didn't raise. The air hung thick with unspoken tension, a silent promise of chaos about to bloom. Just seconds remained before the wheels kissed the earth, and I found myself whispering a chilling vow into the ear of a woman consumed by incandescent rage. One more word, just one, and I would weave a tapestry of legal consequences so intricate it would ensnare her for decades. Her silence was a victory, however fragile, a testament to the power of cold, hard reality piercing through the delusion of invincibility. Below, the lights of Denver painted a breathtaking canvas, a sprawling constellation against the velvet night. The landing was a controlled descent into a world of consequence. The roar of the reverse thrusters a symphony of salvation, a sweet relief washing over me. We were grounded. Finally, the nightmare suspended, at least for now. Then they arrived, a silent legion cloaked in authority. Not the familiar faces of airport security, but agents, FBI, and local police, an imposing force moving with unsettling grace. Two approached, their eyes sharp and assessing. Credentials flashed, a brief exchange of information, and then they were taking her away, the steel cuffs biting into her wrists, a stark contrast to the comfortable restraints I had used. An agent paused, his gaze lingering on my casual attire. Dress code camouflage, I explained, a subtle dig at the woman's theatrical defiance. He remained stoic, unmoved, but the victory, however small, was mine. Her face was a mask of crumbling defiance, the realization of her predicament descending like a suffocating shroud. The game was over, and the stakes were impossibly high. The other passengers, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, witnessed the unraveling of a carefully constructed illusion. As she was led away, her eyes locked onto mine, the embers of hatred rekindled. "You have no idea who you've just messed with," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "I will own you." My response was calm, devoid of the fire she expected. "People like me," I stated, my voice devoid of emotion, "are the only reason people like you get to land safely." The words struck her like a physical blow, shattering the foundations of her self-importance. Later, after the formal statements and the weary smiles from grateful travelers, I sat alone in the empty cabin, the adrenaline replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. It was just another Tuesday, another flight, another crisis averted. A text message from Dave broke through the silence. "Landed yet? How was the flight?" I hesitated, the urge to tell him everything warring with the ingrained need to disappear into the background. "Landed," I replied simply. "Uneventful." A week later, her face filled a news screen, not as a martyr, but as a cautionary tale. Her own arrogance, amplified by the insatiable hunger of social media, had become her undoing. The live stream, intended as a weapon, had become the evidence against her, a time-stamped record of her descent into chaos. The airline had stripped her of her elite status, banned her from all future flights. Leah, the flight attendant, sent me the internal flag: "Do not upgrade. Do not serve alcohol. Do not engage." A cruel, bureaucratic epitaph to a spectacular fall from grace. Even the FAA had weighed in, a hefty fine threatening to bankrupt her, a final, brutal irony. She had sought to punish the airline, but in the end, she had only destroyed herself. I silenced my phone, pulled my hoodie tighter, and leaned back, preparing for the next flight, the next challenge. The world is filled with those who believe the rules don't apply to them, and it is filled with quiet, weary souls like me, diligently making sure they do.